The first call came at 11:13 p.m. I was sitting in my office, finishing up a report on a cheating spouse case when my phone buzzed on the desk. The number was blocked. I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Ray Parker," I answered, leaning back in my chair. No response, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. "Hello?" I said again, this time more forcefully. Still nothing. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a voice, low, steady, and unsettlingly calm, whispered, "You'll see her soon." I didn't think much of it at first. Crank calls weren't exactly rare in my line of work. But the next morning, a woman named Emily Hart walked into my office. She was in her late 30s, with dark circles under her eyes and a tension in her jaw that spoke of sleepless nights. "Mr. Parker, I need your help," she said, clutching her purse like it was a life preserver. "Someone's been calling me, threatening me. They say they know what I did." "And what did you do?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her bag. "Nothing. I don't know what they're talking about." People lie. It's a fact of life. But the fear in her eyes was real. "Tell me about the calls," I said, pulling out a notepad. "They started 2 weeks ago," she began. "Always late at night. They're quiet at first. Then they start talking, saying things about my life, things no one else should know. Last night they said they're watching me, that they know I'm alone." She lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, worked as a nurse at a local hospital, and had no known enemies. At least that's what she claimed. But her anxiety was palpable, and I decided to take the case. The first night of the stakeout was uneventful. I parked my car down the street from Emily's house, watching for anything unusual. Her small 2-story home was dark, except for the glow of a single lamp in the living room. The street was quiet, the kind of place where people locked their doors but never expected to need to. At 11:15 p.m., her phone rang. Through the binoculars, I could see her tense as she picked it up. She spoke briefly, then hung up, her hands shaking. I made a note of the time and waited. An hour later, a black sedan cruised slowly down the street, its headlights off. It stopped briefly in front of Emily's house before continuing on. The next morning, I traced the vehicle's plates to a rental company. The car had been rented under a fake name with cash. Dead end. When I reviewed the recordings from the phone tap I'd installed, the caller's voice chilled me. "You can't hide forever, Emily. We're closer than you think." Emily finally broke down after the 4th night of calls. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "A year ago, I was driving home late at night. I hit someone. A man. He came out of nowhere. I panicked and drove off." She buried her face in her hands. "I didn't know what to do. I checked the news every day, but there was nothing. No reports, no witnesses. I thought maybe he survived, but now..." I kept my expression neutral, though my stomach churned. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "I was scared," she said. "I thought it would ruin my life." It didn't take long to find the victim. His name was Daniel Carter, a 42-year-old accountant who'd been reported missing around the time of the accident. His case had gone cold, but the details matched Emily's story, and now someone knew, someone who wanted revenge. The calls escalated. They weren't just at night anymore. They came during her shifts at the hospital, while she was driving, even while she was grocery shopping. The messages became more explicit. "You'll pay for what you did," one said. Another, "We're coming for you." I widened the scope of my investigation, digging into Daniel Carter's family and friends. His wife, Lisa, had been vocal about her grief, appearing on local news to plead for answers. His brother, Mark, had a criminal record and a temper to match. But the trail always led back to dead ends, until I found the burner phone. I'd been watching the black sedan on and off for days, and it finally slipped up. The driver left the car unattended while grabbing coffee, and I took the opportunity to plant a tracker. It led me to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. Inside, I found a prepaid phone and a notebook filled with meticulous details about Emily's life, her routines, her habits, her fears. The driver was Mark Carter. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. "She killed my brother," he said, his voice flat. "She left him to die like an animal. She doesn't get to move on." "And the calls? The threats?" I asked, to make her feel what he felt. Helpless, alone, scared. I handed the evidence over to the police. Mark was arrested for harassment, but his actions opened a door Emily couldn't close. She confessed to the hit and run, and while the legal fallout would take time, her life was forever changed. Some cases stick with you, and this was one of them. Emily's choices had set a chain of events into motion that spiraled out of control. Justice had been served, but it came at a cost for everyone involved. I still think about the first call, the quiet malice in that voice. Some monsters aren't born, they're made. And sometimes justice isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about who can live with the consequences. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. The landlord's voice on the phone was shaky but firm, the kind of tone you get when you're just a little too close to losing control. It's not just about the money, Mr. Parker. Something's not right. He's gone, and I think he left something behind. I'd heard stranger things, but not much. 10 years as a private investigator teaches you to file away the bizarre and focus on the facts. Landlords whining about unpaid rent, that was practically a Monday. But there was an edge to his words, something under the surface that pricked at my curiosity. "You'll pay my usual rate?" I asked, twirling a pen between my fingers. "Yes, of course," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "Just come out here. I'll explain everything." That's how I ended up standing outside a crumbling 3-story walk-up on the edge of the city. The kind of place where the brickwork looked like it was barely holding itself together, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and regret. The landlord, a wiry man in his 50s with darting eyes, met me at the front door. His name was William Pierce, and he looked as though he'd aged a decade in the past week. "Apartment 3B, he said, pointing up the narrow staircase. "He hasn't paid rent in 3 months, but it's not just that. I went in to see if he'd skipped town, and, well, you'll see." The air grew heavier as I climbed the creaky stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The building seemed unnaturally silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. When I reached the 3rd floor, the door to 3B was slightly ajar. A faint, acrid smell wafted out, making my nose wrinkle. The place was a mess. Clothes were strewn across the floor. A few plates of uneaten food sat on the counter, crusted with mold. But it was the walls that stopped me in my tracks. They were covered in scratches, long jagged lines etched deep into the plaster, as if someone had been clawing at them with feral desperation. "What the hell?" I muttered, running a finger along one of the gouges. The edges were sharp, fresh. Pierce stood in the doorway, wringing his hands. "I didn't know what to make of it," he said. "At first I thought maybe he had a dog, but I've never seen one. Then I figured maybe he, lost his mind." "Any sign of him?" "No," Pierce replied. "Just his stuff, and this." He pulled out a small black notebook and handed it to me. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, but when I flipped it open, the pages were filled with jagged handwriting. Most of it was incoherent, ramblings about being watched, feeling trapped, and hearing things inside the walls. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. "I can't take it anymore. I'm not safe here. I'm leaving before it's too late." Over the next few days, I dug into the tenant's past. His name was Alan Drake, a graphic designer with no criminal record and a clean history. Nothing about him screamed trouble, but the deeper I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. His listed address prior to moving into 3B didn't exist. His emergency contact number led to a disconnected line. It was as if Alan Drake had appeared out of thin air. When I visited his workplace, a small design firm downtown, his coworkers seemed uneasy. Alan was quiet, one of them said, avoiding my gaze. Kept to himself, but the last few weeks before he disappeared, he changed. Said he wasn't sleeping, that he felt like someone was watching him. The more I learned, the less sense it made. Then came the night I decided to stake out the apartment. I set up in 3B around midnight, armed with a thermos of coffee and a pocket recorder. The air inside was stifling, heavy with that same acrid smell. I sat in the corner, my back to the wall, and waited. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I was beginning to think this was a waste of time when I heard it. Scratching. It started faint, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the walls. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound. The scratches seemed to move, darting from one side of the room to the other, always just out of reach. I pried open a section of the wall where the sound was loudest. Inside, I found a bundle of small recording devices, hidden carefully. I played one, and Alan's voice crackled through the speaker. "I don't know who they are. I don't know why they're doing this, but they're watching me, listening. They want me gone." I froze. This wasn't paranoia. It was surveillance. Someone had been stalking Alan, driving him to the brink. The scratches on the walls weren't random. They were Alan's desperate attempts to find and disable the devices. The recordings painted a grim picture. Alan had discovered someone was tapping into his life, but he didn't know who. He'd written about shadowy figures, unmarked vans, and strangers who seemed to follow him wherever he went. He tried to fight back, but the constant surveillance broke him. As I pieced everything together, I noticed something strange in the notebook, a symbol Alan had drawn repeatedly. It matched a logo I'd seen on a flyer in the lobby, a local security firm advertising discreet protection services. I paid the firm a visit, posing as a potential client. What I found was a company with a shady history, allegations of harassment, illegal surveillance, and driving tenants out of buildings to make way for new developments. Alan had been a victim of a campaign to force him out of 3B, and he'd unraveled under the pressure. I confronted Pierce, who eventually cracked under questioning. He'd hired the firm to deal with Alan after he fell behind on rent, not realizing how far they'd go. "I didn't know they'd do all that." He stammered, guilt written all over his face. Alan was gone, but his belongings told his story. He'd left to escape the harassment, leaving behind a life torn apart by fear. I filed a report with the authorities, but I knew justice would be slow if it came at all. Now, every so often, I'll catch myself glancing at the walls of my office, wondering if I'm being watched. The world is full of predators, and not all of them hide in the shadows. Some just wear suits and call themselves professionals. Being a private investigator means learning to live in the gray. People lie, stories don't add up, and the truth is usually buried under layers of deceit. But when Lisa O'Donnell walked into my office, I knew this case was going to be different. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she handed me a photo of a man in his early 30s. "This is my husband, Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been missing for 3 days. Have you contacted the police?" I asked, flipping the photo over. On the back was a date scribbled in black ink, the day he disappeared. "Yes," she said, nodding, "but they're not taking it seriously. They think he just left. But Jack wouldn't do that. He wouldn't leave me." Jack O'Donnell worked as a software developer for a mid-sized tech firm. By all accounts, he was a creature of habit, home by 6, dinner by 7, in bed by 10. No history of infidelity, no debts, no enemies, but something about the way Lisa described him felt rehearsed, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. I started with the basics. His phone was still active, but hadn't been used since the night he vanished. His car, a black sedan, was parked in its usual spot in their apartment complex. Security footage showed him leaving for work on the morning of his disappearance, but never returning. When I visited his office, his coworkers were tight-lipped. "Jack was quiet," one of them said, "kept to himself, but the last few weeks he seemed different, distracted." I asked to see his desk. It was neat to the point of obsession, every item perfectly aligned. But tucked away in the bottom drawer, I found a folded piece of paper. On it was a list of dates and times, each one marked with the word witness. The dates on the list didn't make sense at first. They didn't correspond to meetings, deadlines, or anything significant in Jack's professional life. But when I cross-referenced them with local news archives, a chilling pattern emerged. Each date matched a violent crime, a mugging, a hit and run, a robbery, all unsolved. I drove to the address of the most recent incident, a convenience store where the clerk had been shot during a late-night robbery. The place was still open, the bullet hole in the counter covered by a poorly placed sticker. The owner, an older man named Miles, remembered Jack. "He came in a lot," Miles said, scratching his beard. "Always bought the same thing, a pack of gum and a bottle of water." "What about the night of the robbery?" I asked. Miles's face darkened. "He was here, sitting in his car outside. I remember because I thought it was strange. He didn't come in, just sat there, staring. The more I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Jack had been present at every crime scene on the list, always on the periphery, always just another face in the crowd. It wasn't coincidence. He was following something, or someone. Then came the break. Lisa called me late one night, her voice shaking. "Someone's been in the apartment," she said. "I found the front door unlocked and this." She sent me a photo of a single sheet of paper left on their kitchen counter. It was blank except for one word written in bold black ink: witness. I went back to Jack's office that night, determined to find the missing piece. I combed through his computer, his files, anything that might give me a clue. Hidden in a password-protected folder, I found it. A series of photos taken with a long lens. Each one showed a man in various public places, walking down the street, sitting in a park, entering a building. In every photo, the man's face was partially obscured, but his intent was clear. Jack had been stalking him. The file names were dates, matching those on the list I'd found in his desk. I ran the man's face through a facial recognition database and got a hit. His name was Eric Harlow, a drifter with a rap sheet a mile long. Assault, theft, even a murder charge that had been dismissed on a technicality. He'd been in the area during every crime on Jack's list. I tracked Harlow to a rundown motel on the edge of town. He answered the door with a smirk, the kind that makes your skin crawl. "What's this about?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Jack O'Donnell," I said. "You know him?" His smirk widened. "Can't say I do." I shoved one of the photos into his chest. "Then why does he have pictures of you? Why was he following you?" Harlow's expression darkened. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about. Now get off my property before I call the cops." But as I turned to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought, "Tell Jack he should have minded his own business." The pieces clicked into place on the drive back. Jack had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have. Harlow wasn't just a petty criminal. He was orchestrating these crimes, using others to do his dirty work while he stayed in the shadows. And Jack, for reasons I could only guess, had decided to track him. Maybe it was guilt, maybe a sense of justice. But he'd gotten too close. I called Lisa, but she didn't answer. When I arrived at her apartment, the front door was ajar. Inside, the living room was a mess, furniture overturned, papers scattered. On the coffee table was another note. He knew. Now you do too. The police found Jack's body a week later, buried in a shallow grave outside the city. Lisa moved away, leaving no forwarding address. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for me to dig too deep. Sometimes the truth isn't worth finding. Sometimes it's better to leave the shadows undisturbed.